Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Serpent in Paradise by Jayne Krentz, narrated by Amy Mcfadden. Chapter 1. She was not at all the sort of woman with whom he wanted to have an affair. Jase Lassiter lounged quietly in the shadowy depths of the huge curving rattan chair and watched her through slightly narrowed eyes. She was seated on the other side of the tavern's open-air terrace, near the railing. Partially obscured by the overarching back of her chair, she watched every man who came into the bar with a strange, tense expectancy that faded in moments when he failed to approach her table. "She's waiting for someone," Lassiter thought. "A man." He was vaguely aware of an unaccountable unease at the thought. Any man? Or one special man? Here on St. Clair, she must be several thousand miles from home, and she looked it. Out of place, he told himself. A tourist whose South Pacific vacation was not living up to the promises in the travel agency brochure? Or a woman who had arranged to meet a lover on a clandestine vacation in the tropics? That last possibility seemed to fit the circumstances. It would explain the tense expectancy in her as she surveyed each new arrival at the Serpent. It would explain why she had come alone to a bar frequented mainly by locals and a scattering of knowledgeable tourists who were just beginning to discover St. Clair. It explained a lot of things about her. So, why didn't he like the explanation? Jase's mouth twisted wryly as he reached for the rum in front of him. The sardonic grimace was almost out of character for him. Any unnecessary gesture or movement was out of character. There was a certain waiting quality about Jase Lassiter, a vast stillness in him that seemed to come from his depths. There was nothing quiet or calm about the woman who had emerged out of the warm tropical night to choose a secluded seat in his bar. She was tense, nervous, restless, and very vulnerable. Not at all the sort of female he would normally choose to go to bed with him. So why couldn't he take his eyes off her? Perhaps he'd been on St. Clair a little too long. A nagging sense of deterioration nibbled at the edges of his consciousness, and he ruthlessly shoved it aside. It wasn't that he'd been in the tropics too long, Jase decided grimly. He'd simply been too long without a woman. He took another swallow of the rum. But she wasn't the right sort. He needed a sophisticated, rather jaded, jet-setting traveler who would view a few nights in his bed as an interesting, faintly amusing souvenir of her trip, much more fun to discuss when she got back home than a collection of seashells. The sort of tourist who found St. Clair usually fit into the right category. The island was far enough off the beaten path to discourage the average middle-class tourist, for whom a South Seas vacation was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Instead, in addition to the occasional U.S. Navy ship, a collection of expatriates, and the usual flotsam and jetsam that wound up in such South Seas ports, St. Clair tended to attract a small group of world-weary tourists looking for Eden. The visitors usually didn't stay long, but while they were there, a few could be counted upon to search out the Serpent, a flourishing oasis in the somewhat scruffy paradise of St. Clair. And among those who turned up in the nightclub, Jase could sometimes find what he needed. But not tonight. Tonight, he found himself strangely intrigued by a woman who should have been safely home in the States, supervising a couple of kids and a devoted husband. Precisely the wrong sort of woman, Jase told himself once more as he took another sip of the rum. Then again, she was in precisely the wrong sort of place. Where was the man for whom she was so obviously waiting? In spite of himself, he found his eyes following her quick, expectant gaze as she watched the entrance. What would he be like, this man she had come so far to meet? What would it be like to be the man who could satisfy that sense of anticipation in her, the one who could soothe that vulnerable, high-strung temperament? "I'm a fool," Jase muttered a little savagely to himself as he got to his feet and reached down to collect the glass of rum he had been drinking. This was what came from doing without a woman too long. he decided laconically, as he moved slowly across the room toward the table occupied by the lady tourist. Doing without for too long made a man do foolish things, like introduce himself to the kind of female who would undoubtedly tell him to go straight to hell. On the other hand, he thought wryly, she was on his territory, and she had managed to pique a sense of curiosity he would have sworn was quite dead. For having been guilty of intriguing him, she deserved the consequences of figuring out how to deal with him when he approached her. It might be interesting to see how she managed that. It was going to be amusing to see if that look of expectancy came into her eyes as he came close. Even more amusing to see how long it lasted. Jase watched what he could see of her profile as he made his way toward her table. She wasn't aware of him, her whole attention focused on the entrance to the bar. Again, the question sizzled through his brain. Was she waiting for a special man, or just any man? If the latter was the case, why not him? Perhaps she was, after all, merely a fast-lane tourist looking for some tropical action. If she was only searching for a little adventure, perhaps he could persuade her to let him try to provide whatever it was she sought. God knows I need something myself, he thought, and then experienced a flicker of self-disgust. Was he actually starting to feel sorry for himself? Ridiculous. There was a cure for what ailed a man at times like this. He wondered if the woman across the room would be willing to provide it. She didn't see him until he was almost upon the little table. When her peripheral vision belatedly registered the man's presence, Amy Shannon reacted with a flinch of startled surprise, and as anyone who knew her could have predicted, disaster ensued. The nearly full wine glass that had been resting near her right hand toppled over as her fingers bumped into it. The Burgundy that the Serpent served as its house wine ran in a small wave across the surface of the polished wooden table and cascaded over the far edge. Amy watched the entire process with fatalistic acceptance. "I'm sorry," the man drawled softly in a voice as dark and rich as good sherry. "I didn't mean to startle you." "Then you shouldn't sneak up on people," Amy retorted, more as a matter of form than anything else. Automatically, she began dabbing rather uselessly at the spilled wine with the tiny napkin that had accompanied the glass. The man standing beside her didn't move. He watched her hopeless flurry of effort, and then said blandly, "I'll have that taken care of for you." He nodded toward the thin young man with the trim beard who worked behind the bar. "You'd better be careful, or you'll get wine all over your slacks," Amy noted irritably. She eyed the khaki trousers as if it was only a matter of time before they became involved in the disaster. The stranger ignored the potential peril, however, merely standing politely aside so that the bartender could mop up the evidence of Amy's awkwardness. "Don't worry about it," the bartender said sympathetically. "Have another glass on the house." "Thank you, Ray," Amy said, humbly grateful. She had met him a little earlier, when he'd first served her. She'd asked him who had done the hauntingly lovely paintings of St. Clair that hung on the Serpent's walls. Ray Matthews had shyly confessed that he was the painter responsible. "Strictly an amateur," he'd assured her hastily. He cleaned up and then retreated behind the bar. By the time the mess had been cleared and a new glass of Burgundy had appeared on her table, Amy realized she now had company. The quiet stranger had somehow invited himself to join her. She blinked in confusion as he lowered himself into the rattan chair across from her. Then, in a rush of delayed realization, it occurred to her that this might be the man she was searching for. "Who are you?" she demanded bluntly. "Him, I hope." Over the unsteady flame of the candle on the table, Amy looked fully into his face for the first time. She found herself gazing into the most unusual pair of eyes she had ever seen. Turquoise, she thought with a measure of wonder. He's got eyes the color of turquoise, and just as hard and unreadable as any gemstone. "What are you talking about?" A flicker of wry amusement lit his face as he leaned back in the oversized chair. "I hope I'm him," he explained softly. "The man you're so obviously waiting for." Amy swallowed in astonishment. Was this Dirk Haley? In hasty assessment, she ran her gaze quickly over his features, trying to mesh the reality of the man with her own inner preconception. The color of his eyes was surely the only beautiful thing about him, she thought uneasily. The rest could only be described in terms of not. Not beautiful, not handsome, not gentle, not fully civilized. He was probably somewhere in his mid-30s, Amy decided, but she would have been willing to bet that he had already learned more about the dark side of life than most of her acquaintances would know by the time they were in their 80s. His hair, the shade of deep mahogany, was cut in a casual style and combed roughly back from the hard planes of his face. The nose was a bluntly carved hunk of granite that went well with the equally aggressive jawline. The mouth looked as if it could be either savage or sensuous, and Amy shivered a little at the dichotomy. She didn't think she would want to be the focal point of either emotion from him. Surprisingly, there was little about the stranger to suggest he had succumbed to the seedy, entrapping pull of the tropics. The rum hadn't yet extracted its vengeance, Amy guessed. Either that or somehow he had defied the odds and learned to control it, instead of vice versa. But surely it would be only a matter of time before he wound up with that dissipated, weary look she associated with expatriates living in the South Seas. Still, the body beneath the khaki shirt and slacks looked hard and strong, she realized. There was a sense of quiet power in him that made itself felt. Amy didn't care for the feeling. Her personal preferences didn't matter, however. She was there on business. "You're all wrong, you know," the man was saying conversationally as he scanned her with cool consideration. "I am?" Amy frowned, not understanding. You ought to be cool and sophisticated, a little world-weary and jaded, perhaps. Ideally, you should be beautiful and blasé enough to carry this off properly." Amy looked at him through narrowed eyes. "You may take your complaints to another department. I'm only here to get some answers, not an assessment of my person and character." "I wasn't complaining," he said gently. "I find your person and character rather intriguing, as a matter of fact." Amy shook her head once in silent denial of the statement. She knew full well what he saw when he looked at her. It was a little hard to imagine why he should find her interesting. Then it hit her. "I gather I'm something of a novelty?" she hazarded dryly. "Let's just say you appear a little out of place here in the Serpent. Out of place on St. Clair, come to that." She waited while he finished a deliberate perusal of her tense figure. Amy didn't appreciate the laconic scrutiny, but she thought she understood the motivation behind it. She probably did appear a little out of place here on this remote island. Her kind of tourist usually stopped in Hawaii. But then, she wasn't really a tourist. His turquoise eyes wandered over her spice-colored hair. The tawny strands were anchored in a loose knot on top of her head. Amy had fastened the long length in that fashion as a defense against the warmth and humidity of the evening. The style emphasized her wide, candid eyes, whose color hovered somewhere between gray and green. Amy staunchly refused to let her gaze waver from his face as he took in the effect of her firm, straight nose, cheekbones that were less than classic, and a reasonably well-defined throat line. Her overall appearance was one of attractive wholesomeness, as far as Amy was concerned. She spent a lot of time and energy trying to disguise the wholesome aspects and play up the attractive part. Unfortunately, it was difficult to do under the best of circumstances. In the heat and sultry atmosphere of St. Clair, she hadn't even bothered with her normal makeup. Her expressive mouth twisted slightly at the thought, and amusement shone in her gray-green eyes. What had Dirk Haley been expecting? Her body, too, lacked the sophistication she would have preferred. It had neither sleek elfin slenderness nor sensuous voluptuousness. Instead, the breasts were nicely rounded but small, and the hips were a little too well rounded for Amy's satisfaction. Still, it was a strong, healthy body, and, having reached the mature age of 28, Amy had decided to stop worrying about her figure. She was dressed in a white cotton dress that just skimmed her body, leaving throat and arms bare. It had been too hot to wear pantyhose, so she had slipped into a pair of low white sandals before heading for the Serpent. Her only jewelry was a tiny gold chain around her neck. "All wrong," Jase repeated, almost wistfully. "Look," Amy began a little grimly, "I'm not sure what you were expecting, but I hardly think it matters. Are you going to introduce yourself?" "So straightforward." He sighed. "Aren't you even going to flirt a little?" She stared at him, astounded. "Why should I do that?" "Because I know how to handle that approach. I'm not too sure how to deal with the more businesslike, direct style," he explained. "Well, that's the only approach you're going to get from me," she told him heatedly. "Introduce yourself." "Jase Lassiter," he returned obediently, inclining his head with grave politeness. She drew in her breath. "Very well, Mr. Lassiter." If that was the name he wanted to use, it was all right with her. "Do we have to be that businesslike about it? Couldn't you at least call me Jase?" "Jase." She repeated the name stonily, her brows lowering into a line. "Now can we proceed to business?" "Is this the way it's done back in the States these days? No flirting, no delicate innuendos, no attempt at romance?" He shook his head in mock regret. "I am not in a joking mood," she hissed, her fingers clenching the stem of her wine-glass. "Would you kindly skip the wisecracks, Mr. Haley, or Mr. Lassiter, or whatever it is you want to call yourself, and get to business?" Jase regarded her thoughtfully. "Haley?" he finally asked simply. Amy froze. "Aren't you... I mean, you're not Dirk Haley?" she whispered carefully. "In a word, no. I haven't the foggiest notion of who Dirk Haley is. But I'm more than willing to take his place. I think." His hard mouth curved faintly as he watched her widening eyes. Then, with a smooth, controlled swiftness that surprised Amy, he reached out and removed the tottering wine-glass from her too tense grip. "The Burgundy isn't the best, but it's a shame to waste any more of it this evening," he remarked calmly, setting the glass down safely out of her reach. Amy's appalled glance went to the glass and back to his face. "If you're not Haley, then who the hell are you? Why did you come over to my table?" "I've told you, I'm Jase Lassiter," he said quietly. "I own this place." "Oh." Amy stared at him, unable to think of anything else to say. "I know. Sometimes that's about all I can find to say about it, too. Oh." He lifted one strong hand in a negligent, dismissing gesture, and something close to humor was evident in his turquoise eyes. "But it's a living. Are you going to tell me who you are?" Amy considered the question closely for a moment, and then decided there was probably no harm in revealing her name. He might even be able to help her find the man she was supposed to be meeting. "Amy Shannon." "Amy Shannon." He tried the name out cautiously, testing it. "Where are you from, Amy Shannon?" "San Francisco." "2 kids and a husband, right? Does the husband know how far beyond Hawaii you came on this little vacation jaunt?" Jase asked, his tone suddenly much too cold. Amy's eyes hardened as she sat back in her chair, chin lifting. "No husband, no vacation, and most definitely no kids. Also, I think, no more questions. Unless you can help me find the person I'm supposed to be meeting tonight, Mr. Lassiter, I would appreciate it if you would remove yourself from the vicinity of my table." He nodded, as if agreeing with her. "I should leave. I shouldn't have come over here in the first place." "Very true." "Then again, perhaps we're looking at this backward. Perhaps you're the one who shouldn't be here. I am, after all, in my own territory." You're the one who appears to have wandered into the wrong place." "I'm here on business, Mr. Lassiter." Amy felt her inner tension building. This whole mess had been bad enough until now, but at least there hadn't been any major problems yet. Everything had gone according to plan. Jase Lassiter, however, was not part of the plan. "You've just said you're here to meet a man. Whoever it was has had the poor manners to miss the rendezvous. Why not let me stand in for him?" "That's utterly ridiculous." Amy got out tightly. "Will you please leave?" Instead of responding immediately, Jase took a long swallow of rum. Amy had the oddest sensation that he was gathering his nerve for the next statement. "I'm told," he finally said, very softly, very deliberately, "that I make a nice souvenir." "What in the world are you talking about?" she breathed, startled. "Much more interesting than assorted shells and coconut candy." He half smiled. "Are you suggesting I take you home with me?" she snapped waspishly, not liking her own reaction to the self-disparagement she thought she sensed in his words. What was the matter with her? She had the strangest impulse to offer a measure of kindness to this hard-bitten stranger. It was ludicrous under the circumstances. "Oh, no, I wouldn't expect you to go that far," he assured her seriously. "I was thinking more in terms of an experience. You know, something to chat about when you get home." "I see. Something along the lines of what I did on my vacation?" Amy muttered furiously. "Forget it. I haven't come all this way just to have an affair with some sleazy expatriate who runs a South Seas bar." "Put that way, it does sound a little tacky, doesn't it?" He sighed, but he made no move to get out of his chair. "Very tacky." "Are you sure there aren't any kids or a trusting husband back in San Francisco?" he asked again. "Of course I'm sure." Rather vengefully, Amy reached for her glass of Burgundy and took a large sip. Then, feeling goaded, she asked, "Why, would it matter?" "It might," he admitted. "You amaze me," she retorted dryly. "You don't expect sleazy proprietors of South Pacific bars to have any ethics?" he drawled. For the first time, there was a hint of steel buried somewhere in the sherry-rich voice. Some instinct in Amy recognized the warning for what it was. Jase Lassiter was willing to be pushed a bit, but there were limits. "I only meant that I'm amazed it would bother you to have a brief affair with a married woman. After all, I doubt you ever see any of your tourist acquaintances again after they leave the island." He looked at her very steadily over the rim of his glass. "If there was just a husband or a boyfriend involved, I might sacrifice a few of my ethical standards, especially if the woman in question was making a distinct effort to sacrifice a few of her own standards. But, strange as it may seem, I draw the line when there's a whole family involved. If you've got kids, as well as a husband, Amy Shannon, you're safe from my sexual invitations." Amy couldn't help it. She began to giggle. The giggle turned into a chuckle, and the chuckle into a full-throated laugh. "It's that funny?" Jase inquired curiously. "I'm sorry," Amy managed, making an effort to bring her flash of humor under control. "But not even to save myself from a shabby vacation fling would I make up a bunch of kids waiting at home." She forced back the last of the dying laughter and let it fade into a genuine smile. Jase stared at her mouth, as if temporarily fascinated by the smile. Then he lifted his eyes to meet hers. "You don't like kids?" Amy shook her head, still mildly amused. "Not every woman is, by definition, maternal in nature. What about you, Jase? Did you leave a wife and a bunch of kids back in the States when you decided to follow the sun?" "The wife left me, and there were no kids." There was a crispness about the way he spoke that told her the topic was closed. Amy lifted one shoulder in an attempt to show that she didn't particularly care to pursue such a personal discussion anyway. Silently, though, she found herself wondering about the life Jase Lassiter had left behind when he'd made his way to the South Pacific. Was his the usual tale of a man who could no longer handle responsibility and had chosen to escape to a world where people didn't ask a lot of questions or put too much pressure on each other? Or was there some personal tragedy involved? "So," Jase was saying deliberately, "now that we have established that neither of us is betraying a spouse or a family, is there any reason why I can't seduce you?" "One major reason that I can think of," Amy retorted, "is that I'm not interested." "But you've already said you're here to meet a man." "On business." "Curiouser and curiouser. Tell me about this business." "No." "Don't I have a right to know something about it?" he demanded persuasively. "After all, you're trying to arrange it here in my bar." "It wasn't my idea. I was told to wait here," Amy explained stiffly. "To meet whom?" "Someone named Dirk Haley," she exploded, annoyed. "Who's Haley?" "I thought people out here respected each other's privacy," she snapped. "A myth. People are people. We're just as curious about each other as people are back in the States," Jase murmured. "And I am getting extremely curious about you in particular." "Because I look so out of place," she finished for him with a groan. "Look, you've said yourself that I'm all wrong," she began forcefully. He leaned forward with an abrupt movement that made her jerk backward. She realized that she hadn't expected restless or unnecessary actions from this man. When he did move, it would be with purpose, and that could be dangerous. Uneasily, she eyed his set, unyielding features. "You're all wrong," he told her ruthlessly, "because there is something rather soft and vulnerable about you. You're all wrong because you face a man with a straightforward expression instead of cool calculation. You're all wrong because you look as if you ought to be wearing some man's ring instead of traipsing off to the South Pacific to carry out an illicit rendezvous. You're all wrong because there is something rather endearing and rather sexy about you that makes me want to stay when I should leave. And you're all wrong because I find myself too damned interested in finding out who you're meeting and why you're meeting him in my bar. Is he married, Amy? Is this Dirk Haley some married businessman on his way back from a trip to the Orient who had you fly out here to meet him for a few stolen days?" "No." She glared at him, shocked. "I've never even met Haley in person. And while you draw the line at dating a woman with a family, I draw the line at dating a man who is married. I realize that living out here probably isn't conducive to developing an objective view of human nature, so allow me to tell you that your assessment of me is rather far off the mark. Now, if you don't mind—" "What's your assessment of me?" he interrupted calmly. That threw her for an instant. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me." Amy shook her head. "You're not going to just give up and go away, are you?" "I belong here," he reminded her equably. "You're the outsider. You're the one who should give up and go away if you don't like the atmosphere." "You're probably right." She surprised herself by agreeing unhappily. "But I've come too far now to just give up and go home." "So tell me what you think of me," he ordered roughly, sinking back into the shadowy depths of the chair. Perhaps it was the combined effects of jet lag and the tension she was under. Perhaps it was because she was feeling taunted, a little goaded. Or perhaps she was simply feeling a bit reckless so far from home. The tropical night, the bar that could have come from the pages of an adventure novel, the baffling man sitting across from her, they all went together to form a slightly unreal scene. Whatever the reason, Amy stared into Jase Lassiter's beautiful turquoise eyes and told him what she thought of him. "I think you are a rather dangerous man," she said starkly. His long lashes lowered slightly, but not before she had seen the flash of surprise deep in his eyes. There was a taut silence before Jase said quietly, I thought I was a rather seedy expatriate proprietor of an island bar. Annoying, perhaps, but not dangerous. Did you? Amy looked away from him, already regretting.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?